Hello, my name is Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Empathy Center located here in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. The center's mission is to build the empathy movement and to raise the level of empathy in society through education and community building initiatives.
And my name is Anita Nowak. I teach at McGill University, and I'm the author of Purposeful Empathy, a book that invites readers to turn up the volume of empathy in their lives.
And at the beginning of 2024, Anita and I co-hosted the Empathy Summit, brought to you by the Empathy Center, and more than 40 authors of books about empathy participated.
They shared what their book was about, why they were motivated to write it, and what they hope readers will take away. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you'll buy their book. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Fagiano. I hope I'm getting that pronunciation right, otherwise you'll tell me. Who is a professor of philosophy at Washington State University, where he conducts research in American pragmatism, ethics, social and political philosophy, and the philosophy of technology. He is the author of Practicing Empathy, Pragmatism, and the Value of Relations. Mark, welcome to our summit. Over to you.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I feel like a little bit of a fish out of water here. There's been so many great things, great advice given, but I do, as a philosopher, feel a little bit like a fish out of water. Maybe that will cause, I heard sometimes when that happens, it has some sort of evolutionary process in the fish. So maybe I'll be able to grow from it. But my general understanding of empathy begins with a historical approach. I start thinking philosophically, what have people meant by empathy? And where did this word emerge historically? I know other people have that approach as well. The reason that drove me to think that way to start off is because I noticed that people seem to mean very different things when the word is uttered and when they point to certain types of experiences. I can give you a couple examples from the book. One is from C. Daniel Batson, his work on perspective taking. And one of his articles that talk about clarifying between different types of perspective taking. For instance, when I take the other perspective of another person, is it I who am taking the perspective of the person as the person, or am I projecting certain elements of my own perspective into the person, and it's what I would do if I were the person, right? So that's one thing that just is a little bit difficult as far as some of the clarity involved in what it really means to take someone's perspective. A lot of people don't choose to use empathy to mean perspective taking, and that caused a lot of more confusion in my mind. For instance, I can just tell you a story. Imagine you're riding a bike in Central Park, we'll make it summer, and you see another bike run into a brick wall. And you go over to the person, they're terribly hurt, and you walk up to them, ask if you're okay. They're knocked out, they need an ambulance. But instead of helping the person, you just ride away. Then later in the day, someone asks, hey, how was your day today? And they say, hey, I was in the park and I saw this person hurt herself or himself against this wall. And the person says, well, what did you do? Did you call the ambulance? And you say, no, I just drove away. But I was empathic because I understood their perspective. You see, in that case, there's a context which makes us rethink, like, what does it mean to be empathic? Is it about taking the perspective, or is it actually about caring for the person, which would have been a lot, I would have cared for the person, obviously, if I would have called the ambulance and helped the person. Other times we hear about empathy as people identifying as an empath, right? So for instance, a person will say, I am an empath, or that I catch people's emotions quite quickly. And so my thought, again, that gave me the impetus to start the book, is like, well, that seems to be quite different from saying taking a perspective or for caring for people. So I would agree with some of the things that are going on here, that empathy is a verb, right? That's a good way of saying it. It's not so much of just one single reality or experience, but it's this dynamic group of different sorts of ways of being in the world. Sometimes, this last thing, just to exemplify this, is, people talk about reason versus empathy, or reason versus emotion. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard someone say to you, stop acting so emotional, be more rational. So like the perfect response to that is, well, is your request for me to act more rational a rational or an emotional request? Because sometimes we separate things in our minds as separate realities, but in experience, it's more fluid. There is a great deal more happening than we admit in the specific way we choose to represent an experience. So I would agree with people talking about empathy being a verb, right? That's a good way of understanding it. So to understand that the best, I look back into history and say, well, where does this word emerge from? Where did it first come about? And I saw that the word empathy comes into the language, English language, around the early 1900s. But before that, there's this whole history of empathy in aesthetics and among the counter-Enlightenment thinkers like Herder and Novalis. Herder and Novalis were two, a poet and a really philosopher of history. That's Herder. And they really didn't like the way the Enlightenment folks were divvying up the world and picturing the world as this very mechanistic place. So this is where we see the use of the word Einfühlung, which means feeling into, right? So it's a sense of a type of perception, a type of directed apprehension of something without anything else yet qualified. So I traced that idea of Einfühlung, starting with Herder and Novalis as counter-Enlightenment thinkers, and then saw how it was adopted in the 1800s in the realm of art. Like if I want to understand a work of art, I need to have that way of projecting my senses into the work so I can understand its beauty. We see this all the time when we're walking down the street. You might turn all of a sudden to see a sunset and you're like captivated, right? So your apprehension of the object, your perception is immediate and focused. So one thing, just to begin with, this first way of looking at empathy shows us that there is this dimension of like apprehending, I call it feeling into, in relation to the word Einfühlung. This continued throughout the 1800s. And then when we see the rise of psychology, we see different sorts of psychologists or aestheticians use Einfühlung to shape the discipline of psychology. And here it starts to become more of a sense of feeling with or being in sync with another person's feelings or thoughts, right? So this is a big shift. This is like a historical shift, moving out of the realm of aesthetics into the realm of psychology. Still, and this is really where we get the notion of empathy as perspective taking, and philosophers like Husserl and Stein have problems with that. I would refer back to what other people said about what some philosophers think, not always so great. And then what we see after this dominance in psychology, when we have the word empathy, we see that empathy starts to mean something more like care. We see this in the late works of the writings of Rogers, but early on in child psychology and the study of childhood play, right? Why is little Johnny being so mean? This isn't just perspective taking. Why is Johnny being so mean and being so mean on the playground? Let's think about how the kid can be more empathic. So basically, these three different dimensions of empathy that I trace historically, I then in the book turn to apply to basic questions about the morality of empathy, the psychological development of empathy, and the role empathy might play in political science or in what pragmatists call democracy as a way of living life. So let me just address those three. I know I'm running short of time. So the first one with morality, you have a lot of writings in the literature that say, well, empathy is, I'm against it, and other people are like, for it, yay. And then for each of these, it's clear that there's a different context that's being looked at to be against or for it. So people who are against it usually say, well, it's just perspective taking, and then, I can take your perspective and then screw you over and be mean, right? Doesn't mean I'm being careful. This is, I think, the book Against Empathy pretty much argues along this line. It's taking one dimension of the pie of the development of the concept, right? And then or somebody who would be for it would then also isolate certain features of it. Now, I'm a consequentialist, I'm a pragmatist. That sort of leaving parts out of the history of the idea do not matter to me at all. all that really matters is the way in which we saw presented here earlier, different ways of understanding function to produce satisfaction or satisfactory consequences. That's the main thought. So when it comes to, like, I'm not a member of the language police. I dropped out a long time ago. I'm more interested in, like, thinking about the consequences of use. Second part, real quickly, chapter 7 on development. Obviously having this pluralistic understanding is very helpful for developing empathy, which I believe is possible. I don't think people are necessarily born with an ability to empathize over others, although women have it all over men early on. It's very clear. And then finally, the last chapter, just thinking about this pluralistic understanding of empathy as a type of a way to think about how to live democratically. So the pragmatists talked about democracy as a way of life. So democracy isn't just a system, right, that we go and vote and we feel so wonderful, like, look what I did. I elected some officials and now they'll go off to Washington and do as they wish, right? It's not just that. It's about the basic development of behavior and certain facets of what it means to act democratically to others. So the last chapter, I finished with that and use it, this pluralistic and pragmatic understanding to think about how we can develop in our own lives certain senses of behaving democratically or contributing to, in our community, democracy as a way of living life, not just as some sort of system where we elect officials to represent us. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Mark, the enthusiasm and energy defies what the typical philosopher prof sounds like. Thank you so much.
For sure.
Catch your breath, grab a glass of water. That was wonderful. Thank you.